Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming. I'm very excited about the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. Aidan, thank you for being with us today to kick things off. So Aidan Gomez is the CEO of Cohere AI, an enterprise-focused AI company based out of Toronto, London, and kind of, right, San Francisco, kind of all over the world at the same time, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the things that Cohere is known for is providing models that are trained on the language of business. So what does that mean? And what does that mean that you can do better?
Yeah, so we're not trying to build a ChatGPT competitor. We're very focused on enterprise. And so we want to be performant in the use cases that enterprises care about. That's a very different set of language and skills than what a consumer might want to do. So we're not trying to optimize for writing poetry or jokes or that type of thing. We're trying to optimize for getting work done. The second piece of that is that multilinguality is a crucial component of it. So speaking multiple languages and making sure that our models are helpful for global organizations.
So I want to dig into that a little bit. But before we leave training the language of business, how different a process is that? How different a creation process is that compared to other LLMs that we hear about?
Yeah, I think it's quite different because there's not a lot of enterprise data just out available on the web. And that's where these models source their data from. You collect from the public web data, train on that. The model learns a lot about that sort of information. But what we do is we internally create data that looks like enterprise data. And so the models are much more familiar with that modality or that type of data. It's a higher burden because you can't just scrape it online. You have to actually create it from scratch yourself. But it leads to much better performance when actually deployed into production.
And are there particular industry sectors that's particularly useful for? Are there particular industry sectors that you're focused on? Like what types of companies do you think can use that best?
Yeah, so our whole thing is privacy. So we haven't done one of these deals where we take $10 billion from one party and become exclusive to them. We're available on every single cloud platform, even on-prem. And so privacy is a big thing for us, and not having them send their data, not having customers send their data to us. We bring our model to their data. So that's been crucial. But yeah, I think in general, the industries that we're most focused on are public sector, finance, healthcare, energy. The folks who are most concerned about privacy tend to be our closest partners.
All right, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about language. So you create large language models. You talked a little bit already about this multilingual approach, but just to talk about that for a little bit. So you have a nonprofit research lab, right? It's called Cohere for AI, and it just released a large language model that supports 100 different languages. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you also just announced a big partnership with Fujitsu, I think, to support Japanese services and LLMs for global companies. So why the focus on multilingual? That's an unusual depth in terms of number of languages. Why that?
Yeah, well, this technology needs to speak the language of its users. It's not useful if it can't interface with users of a global organization that have employees or partners that speak different languages, that have data in different languages. And so it's really table stakes to being able to serve market. We've been focused on that from the start. In particular, I suppose from like a more moral motivation, which is we want this technology to impact and benefit everyone. And if it can't speak your language, you fundamentally can't access it. And language models, they're unique in that it's the first technology we've created that you can just talk to. And so if it's not speaking your language, there's a hard barrier in front of its utility to you. And so we've invested heavily in that. Like you mentioned, Cohere for AI ran what is still the largest open source effort to collect native speaker language from across native speaker language data from across the world, and then release it freely, completely open source. So trying to lift not only our own language model, which I think performs the best in multilingual settings, but everyone's language model, so that it can speak their languages.
And how can it help language models be on your own? And actually, can you talk a little bit about the process of how you did that? So as you said, that's a real challenge in terms of collecting the data, because English is the default language of tech. I mean, that is sort of the reality. So how did you how did you manage that? How were you able to do that? And then how do you think that's going to help other language models besides your own?
Yeah, so the effort was led by Sarah Hucker, who's like a really well-known, famous machine learning person. And what she did was just blast this out, a big marketing campaign to try to reach as many people as possible. She pulled in thousands of speakers of hundreds of different, or 100 different languages, and just got them to teach the model, interact with it, find errors. She also translated a bunch of languages. So she got humans who understand that language to take the English data and convert it into their own. And so, yeah, it was a huge effort involving thousands of people. And it is now the largest open asset of multilingual data.
So talk a little bit about that, about being an open asset. Like how can others access it and make use of it?
You can just download it. You can just download it off the internet and use it to build whatever you want. And so, yeah, we mostly did that initially, to build better language models for Cohere, but if we were taking all of this free work from thousands of people, we didn't want that to be IP of Cohere. We wanted to share this back with everyone. And so that was sort of the social contract with all of these people who were contributing their languages data to us.
All right. Fascinating. So you talked a little bit about the fact that you aren't going to get the benefit of this technology if you're not able to use it. And a big potential barrier there is language. We're actually going to talk later on today. We're going to have Ambassador Neolip Biasiani and Ambassador Kornblue. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is the different approaches between the US and the EU on AI, but also emerging economies and what the major economies can be doing to bring in the emerging economies to this discussion. So in terms of what Cohere is doing and having so many languages accessible, that seems to me like it's going to be a big benefit to people that are in emerging economies that are speaking languages other than English, and sort of the language of the major economies. So do you want to talk a little bit about, was that something that you were thinking about when you decided to approach this, quite in-depth multi-language model?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, our focus on multilingual comes from the fact that we want to serve the entire globe and natural speakers. Our partnership with Fujitsu to develop a Japanese model and bring that to industry. Japan is like a super technologically ambitious nation, and they've been wanting to integrate this technology, but it just doesn't speak Japanese well enough. And so closing that gap between English and these other languages has been really a major focus for us. And yeah, I think this technology is a productivity multiplier, and there are lots of places around the world that are really struggling there. We're not seeing real GDP per capita growth the way that we should be seeing it. And so if it doesn't speak your country's, your nation's language, you're fundamentally blocked from being able to access that benefit. So we're doing everything we can to unblock it.
That's great. That's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about distribution models. So methods. You distribute in various ways. You distribute through API, through SaaS companies, through private deployments, even some on-prem. Are there different risks in those different distribution models?
Yeah, we like to think that we're dramatically less risky because nothing is leaving your VPC or your on-prem instance. It can be completely air-gapped if you want. And so when we work with a partner, there's no net new security risk. We're bringing our model, giving it to you, and you're deploying it inside of your security boundary. So the risks are dramatically lower than sending data across the wire to some other cloud to access a model outside of your VPC. In terms of risk, I think there's more opportunities. The model can now access more data, and so it can see more. And the models are only as useful as the information they have access to. If they lack context, if they can't see part of your business or part of your data, they can't answer questions about it, they can't help you with work involving it. It's like a blind spot to the model. And so a lot of what we currently see as the barrier to adoption is the fact that models need to be integrated into all of these data assets to be useful, to drive value. And so by being able to privately deploy with no new security risks, we can access more data and build something more useful.
Interesting. So one of the things, as you know, policymakers in the United States, in Europe, and other places in the world are very concerned about trying to mitigate and reduce risk as much as possible. And so one of the things that they are interested in is requiring companies to be able to monitor and then fix issues that arise at all different parts of the AI lifecycle, including after it's been distributed. Is that feasible?
It is. For private deployments, it requires, like we don't have access to our customers' data. We don't see that, like that's part of the agreement, is that we're not taking their data, using it to train other stuff. It just completely stays within their ecosystem. So we're not able to observe it. We can't do that for the customer, but what we can do is provide our expertise and guidance on building systems for monitoring the use of language models internally. And so that's what we do. It's an education component that we bring to the table when working with enterprises. I do think post-deployment monitoring is crucial. The first thing that we recommend with enterprises is setting up the ability to evaluate. If you don't know how well a model is performing and how that might change over time, then you're sort of running blind. You don't know how robust your system is. And so very strong evaluations of models has been a crucial step in industry getting the confidence around the technology to adopt it and push it into production.
So am I understanding you that when you work with a partner, it's not just giving them the model, but you're also working with them on how, not just to optimize the performance of it, but also to monitor the performance of it, and then try to address issues? And if issues do arise, then what happens?
Well, we're a partner. So our approach, since we're just focused on enterprise, is that we want to actually work with our customers. We're not just like, here's our model, good luck, have fun. We really want to be a partner there. And so if they run into issues, if they're spotting errors, we're going to be there to help intervene, whether it's training the models further or helping them debug these issues. We're actually present and able to intervene throughout the stack because we build our models from scratch. And so we can intervene at the data layer, pre-training, post-training, RLHF, anywhere we need to intervene, we can.
So let's talk a little bit about responsible AI. Cohere is a relatively new company. Despite that, you have been very involved in responsible AI leadership. I know you were one of the companies that signed the voluntary commitments from the White House, from the United States. You signed the Canadian Code of Conduct. I believe just last week, you signed on to a pledge to try to combat abusive material that's being distributed. So a lot of the commitments focus on safety and transparency. So I'm interested in what has Cohere done internally to try to live up to those commitments?
Yeah, so we have a safety team focused on assessing risk, assessing biases with these models, trying to undo that, building in different safety modes, so the ability to control how the model behaves in different contexts. There's some contexts where you might want the model to be very creative and free, and other contexts where you really don't want it to get into any sensitive conversations and just stick to business.
No jokes.
Yeah, no jokes. Not a very entertaining model. So controllability is key. Like giving our customers the ability to choose which version of the model they want to deploy. And so yeah, there's a huge effort internally building that controllability in and making sure that we're able to prevent potential risks.
You are a relatively new company. You're a relatively small company. There is a lot of discussion right now, as there should be, about what kind of governance mechanisms companies can put in place internally to try to increase, responsible development and deployment of AI. So a question I have for you, as a relatively small company, but one that is obviously deeply immersed in this, are there particular governance mechanisms that you think are unduly burdensome? Are there ones that are just more difficult to put in place? Are there governance mechanisms that you think are better suited to bigger companies versus smaller companies? How do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the concerns with regulation and policy is that it will present a huge burden on startups. And so, Cohere's policy team is quite small relative to the larger players. Actually, larger players have policy teams that are larger than Cohere. And so it's hard for us to be everywhere. And
small but mighty.
Yeah, small but mighty, yeah. So yeah, I think we're definitely concerned about that. We're concerned about stuff like pre-deployment testing in a centralized body where we can't actually compete in market because we can't release a product. We have to send it off to someone else. We have to wait months before they come back and tell us whether it's good. And so that doesn't exist yet, but there's loads of conversations and people pushing for establishing something like that, in which case the only folks who have the runway, time, money to be able to do that sort of thing, it's the largest. And so it will just entrench value in the incumbents. So yeah, I think that sort of thing is problematic. At the same time, I'm not anti-regulation. I think that regulation is actually helpful in driving clarity in regulated industries. So when we talk to customers in the financial sector or healthcare, they're nervous. They're nervous about adopting this technology. There's a lack of clarity around how they can adopt it and what the guardrails should be. And so for them, they need regulation to come in and basically clarify how to adopt it, and then they can move fast. So for us, that will accelerate market adoption, not slow it down.
What about companies that are not AI companies? Companies that are not developing AI, but they're using AI. You have worked with a lot of partners. Do you have thoughts on what kinds of government mechanisms companies that are in other industry sectors should be putting in place?
Yeah, I think it's testing and evaluation. Like, that's the key. For any use cases that you're deploying, for any domains that you're looking to apply these models, you need to be able to assess their performance. And if you don't have an internal measurement strategy, you're running blind. And you really can't rely on external benchmarks. As soon as a benchmark is published, there's like a, 2-month window where it's a valid benchmark or evaluation of models, and then it's gone. People will game it, people will overfit to it, it'll be incorporated into our training data via our data collection. And so public data is going to be trained on and won't be a good evaluation source. So build your own private evaluation suites.
You recently, earlier this week or last week, committed to this pledge to try to combat abusive material. So I have a few questions coming out of that. One is, in terms of abuses or risks from AI, what do you think is the biggest risk today? What's the one you're most concerned about? And what about 5 years from now?
I think the ability for these models to impersonate humans is a very significant risk. I'm concerned about election misinformation, and there's this quote from Borges, the author, and he was like, I'm the average of the last 10 books I've read. I think the modern reality of that is I'm the average of the last 100 posts that I've read on social media. And so what people are presented with really influences their take, and also their notion of consensus. If they're seeing this thing everywhere in social media, they'll believe this is a commonly accepted view, I should adopt it as well. And so if you can very scalably spin up many different fake accounts projecting some idea, it's very effective at swaying a population to, hey, smarter people than me, the crowd has accepted such and such is true. That's one of my major concerns. Now, there are mitigation methods for that. For instance, these new town squares, social media platforms, they can implement human verification so that you know the account on the other side is associated with a credit card, which is associated with a government ID, and they are a human. And so that provides a lot of friction for adversaries who might want to spin up millions of these accounts. So I think there are compelling defense mechanisms. I just don't know if they're sufficiently adopted.
I was just going to ask you, how widely adopted are those types of defense mechanisms?
Well, to Twitter's credit, they were actually the first ones to implement, you can just pay to get verified. You can pay $5 a month, and you're verified as a human. And it's associated with your bank account, your credit card, etc. A lot of others have adopted that since, like Instagram and other places. I actually don't know the adoption statistics of that human verification, but certainly I use it when I'm reading social media. Like, the blue check actually means something. It does add credibility. It's not a completely anonymous source. The other thing that we can do, the model builders, is when we open up APIs to let others use our models, we can monitor that usage, and we can try to track these campaigns and shut them down. So that's something that I know we do, although we don't have a consumer service, so it's less popular to use us, but I know that OpenAI and others are pursuing.
So I was going to ask you, that's a great segue, I was going to ask you a little bit about any technical measures you've put in place at Cohere to try to combat abusive material, fake material.
Yeah, so the internal team that I was talking about, which just focuses on that and is working on reducing biases and mitigating harm, tracking harm as we continue to train the model. How does it change? Does it get worse in certain dimensions? The second piece is monitoring usage, so flagging, use that we don't want to support on the platform and shutting it down quickly. And then the last piece is it's really just foundational technical work. So building stuff like RAG, which is an acronym for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And it's this idea that you can get these models to search and reference private corpuses of knowledge. And then as it's generating a response, each claim that it's making in that response, you force it to justify those claims in the source material. So it gives you two things. The first is that hallucination rates, or these models making stuff up, it drops by a massive degree. It was really like the step change in solving hallucinations. The second thing is auditability. So now you don't just need to trust that hopefully the model is smart enough and what it's saying is true. You can actually check its work. So for each claim, you can click in and you can access the source material and verify that it's drawing a logical inference from it. So better user experience, more trust, more auditability, and explainability.
I love the quote on the last 10 books. And I know that you are a prolific reader. You literally live in the world of language. So I'm curious, what have you read lately that you like? What would you recommend that people read? It can be about AI. It can have absolutely nothing to do with AI.
Okay. I read way less than I would like to. But I recently read a book called Cryptonomicon. And I thought it was going to be like a crypto book, but it was written in '99. And so it predates it massively. It's like a multi-timeline of during World War II and Turing and code breakers. So that notion of cryptography. And then more present day at that time, in the '90s, Silicon Valley, the tech scene that was expanding. And yeah, it was fascinating. It was so prescient. It was really, really incredible read. I think that this guy, you know how there's a mystery around who invented crypto?
Yeah.
I think it might be this guy. Like reading it, he was just suggesting ideas of, taking from the sort of code breaking that Alan Turing was doing and the Brits and the Americans were focused on, cracking Japanese codes and German codes. And then extrapolating that into the future around, can we secure our currencies in this way? And then the notion of, can trading cards I'm not a crypto guy at all. I have no association with it at all. But when I was reading this book, I was like, wow, these ideas were around in '99. Like this is so prescient. So it was very fascinating. Yeah.
So do you think he was hiding in plain sight? I'm writing this like, come find me, the founder of Bitcoin.
Maybe. I Googled it afterwards. I was like, what is the connection? Do people think this is the guy? And no, there was no real suggestion of that. They say he was like an influential figure, but there's no hypotheses that he is the whoever person.
The whoever.
Yeah.
Well, we are going short on time. So my last question is thinking about where AI is today, thinking about how the marketplace and the technology are going to evolve over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. What do you think is going to be the biggest change for the worse? And what do you think will be the biggest change for the better?
Biggest change for the worse. I think things are hopefully only going to get better. I think there's definitely lots of risk with the technology, but people are really concerned about that risk. It dominates our headlines. Everyone's thinking about it. We're throwing tons of technical measures at mitigating it. So I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be okay. I certainly hope that we have good regulation that prevents misuse of the technology, prevents overeager deployment of the technology. I don't want these models prescribing drugs to people without a human in the loop, right? And that regulation already exists. That can't happen. We don't allow that. And so I feel pretty good about that side. In terms of opportunities, the models are going to become dramatically more useful. They're going to integrate much more into our day-to-day lives. They're going to be like partners that we work with. They'll be able to not only just give us answers, which is the current status quo, but do work on our behalf. They'll be able to use the tools that we use to accomplish stuff. And so we'll be able to shift the stuff that we don't want to do onto these models and ask them to do it. And that will hopefully boost productivity, make people's work life dramatically better, easier, and more fun.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being welcome to DC.
Oh,
We're very excited to have you here, and thank you so much for being with us here today. Aidan Gomez, the CEO and co-founder of Cohere.